Katia, you follow the Mississippi River basically and find that 1 in 6 jobs there, it's a state of 4.7 million, is tied to international commerce. How many of those jobs would be at risk in an all-out, full-blown trade war?
Well, Vani, it would be every single one of those 1 in 6 jobs that are tied to international trade. If you just looked at that map and you start from Baton Rouge and you go all the way down to New Orleans, that's just a small chunk of the Mississippi River in Louisiana. And when you think about trade jobs, you think about the ports, you think about the people who are loading the freighters, you think about the 800 ships at any given point that are on that river between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and you think about all the jobs tied to that, as well as the refineries, as well as the coal. I mean, there's just so much happening in that state, and it's the most reliant of any state in the U.S. on international trade. It also happens to be the most red. In 2016, the state had the highest number of votes for Donald Trump than any other candidate in that state's history, Republican or Democrat. So it's interesting to go to this microcosm of how this trade war would play out across the U.S., but also to see people who actually support the president and his economic policies who would be really hard hit by this.
You have a great example. You say barges filled with Japanese steel could offload at factories along the river and then head as empty containers to the South Louisiana port, where they're cleaned, serviced and filled with soybeans destined for China. So that's a really phenomenal sort of microcosm of what actually takes place. You say that voters vote red. Do they realize just how tied to international trade their jobs are? Are they expressing this?
That is a really good question, and that's one of the first questions I would ask the people I spoke with, who, by the way, were incredible. I mean, people opened up their businesses, their homes. In fact, in one case, there was a crawfish boil that I was invited to as a strange reporter in their town. And one thing that I heard was that even though they understand that, for example, the steel and aluminum tariffs, that at the time when I was there, they hadn't even been imposed. And right now, they're firmly set in for our largest trading partners, Mexico, EU, Canada. So even before that, prices were rising for the metal. And one of the characters in my story, Kylie Sparks, who I spoke with, who was in the military, was an ardent supporter of Trump, and he still is, and said simply, all it means is a bit more inflation. All it means is that we pass the cost down to our customers, and they pass it down to their customers, who are us, the buyers of products. So that's sort of the tone is, well, we understand that these policies may be driving prices, but prices are driven by a lot of different market factors, and all in, it's going to be a positive for American businesses, because they do still think that, well, a lot of the people I talk to think that this business will start reinvigorating in Louisiana. So a lot of these closed down steel plants, a lot of the coal plants will be reinvigorated. Unfortunately, that's not what the data says. When you look at labor of economic data, it does show that there are more people, far more people, 30 times more people employed in industries that depend on steel and aluminum rather than steel and aluminum themselves, not to mention all the other commodities and items that are now hit with tariffs.
Yeah, Katia, for our global audience, so we're looking at just whether or not these sorts of policies undermine or continue to give a positive persuasion towards voting for the President Trump in the next elections, for example. I mean, I think back to George W. Bush when his tariffs eventually had to be unwound because it wasn't always the metals that it hit, but it was also the surrounding employment in the entire area. I mean, going forward, do we see that this will have to ever be stepped back from?
So, interestingly enough, the sense that I got from the people I spoke with was that they're still supporting the president. They would still vote for the president. In some cases, there was an executive I spoke with who voted for the president, who is potentially not going to vote in future elections because they're conflicted, because they have seen that the president's policies are not good for business, at least for their business, particularly talking about manufacturers and factories. So these are companies where their products are made from dozens of parts from so many different countries. So if you all of a sudden have a tariff, and this was one of the companies I spoke with who his father invented the shrimp depeeler, and it's an incredible machine. We have photos of it actually in the story. So his parts come from all over the world. So if you have tariffs on one country's parts, you have to source those parts from another country. What if they're a different size? What if they're a different shape? That impacts your entire cost structure and all of your agreements and all of your funding. So in that case, he's not very happy with the policies. But I mean, to your question, it's kind of shocking. It's kind of makes you think, but like they're still supporting this U.S. president despite the economic pain